They came out of nowhere. Even radar had missed them. By the time Captain Tome saw the two MiG-21s streaking toward him, it was already too late. They were smaller than his F-105 Thunderchief, weighing roughly half as much. Still, they were heavily armed, with a set of missiles locked on his tail. Tome slammed the throttle, his entire body pushing against his seat as his aircraft tore through the sky at nearly twice the speed of sound. Soviet-made jets would have been outpaced by now, but when the captain glanced to his flanks, the Predators were still there. The last image Tomes ever saw was the white-hot flash of a missile flying straight toward him. With these assassins at large, no American pilot in Vietnam was safe. In the summer of 1941, hundreds of shadows descended from the clouds over Soviet skies. Their growls grew louder as they closed in on their prey below, but the sun was still hours from rising, and no one on the ground could see what hovered above their heads. In air bases across Soviet fields, hundreds of the nation's finest aircraft sat exposed in the open. Bombs began to rain down in waves, shaking the earth with each detonation. Explosions tore through runways, hangars, roads, and nearby towns without distinction, consuming everything in a cloud of fire. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's surprise invasion of the Soviet Union, had begun. It was one of the most devastating blows the nation had ever endured across its long history. It's estimated that nearly 3,000 Soviet aircraft were destroyed during the offensive, including most of the new Mikoyan-Gurevich MiG-1 fighters, wiped out before they even had a chance to prove themselves in battle. The Soviets could not let this insult go unanswered. Herds of the newer MiG-3s began to take off from whatever runways remained intact. On paper, they were faster than the German attackers, and though their weapons were lighter than those of the Luftwaffe, Soviet pilots believed they could still outfly their enemies. It didn't take them long to realize just how wrong they were. At lower altitudes, their speed advantage evaporated, and every sortie became a gamble. And so, as the Luftwaffe kept terrorizing village after village, Soviet engineers worked furiously, determined to forge a new aerial warrior, one that could knock these Nazi birds from the sky once and for all. Soviet aerospace firms worked day and night to deliver the aircraft that could shift the balance of war across European skies, but they were fighting an uphill battle. The nation was years behind in the research that had already allowed Germany to begin assembling jet fighters. Worse still, its industry was on the verge of collapse. Countless factories had either been destroyed by the Nazi advance or hastily relocated eastward, where workers struggled to find even the basic materials needed to keep production alive, let alone create the intricate components to assemble cutting-edge aircraft. But when Germany collapsed, the Soviets were first in line to claim the spoils, among them the blueprints for the Reich's most feared aircraft. Suddenly, they had caught up, and within a year of victory, the MiG-9, the first Soviet turbojet fighter, was already taking off, powered by Soviet-built copies of German engines that pushed it closer than any Soviet design had ever come to the sound barrier, reaching speeds over 500 miles per hour. Yet, as the Cold War began to tighten, the Soviets were hungry for more. Before the decade was out, Mikoyan-Gurevich unveiled the MiG-15, a sleek jet capable of Mach 0.9, or 688 miles per hour. By 1952, the MiG-17 had already built on its predecessor, pushing to Mach 0.93, or 711 miles per hour. Still, the Soviet quest for speed remained unsatisfied. Then, in 1955, after years of relentless research, Mikoyan-Gurevich delivered a machine that could finally shatter the sound barrier. With a maximum speed of 902 miles per hour, the MiG-19 was the fastest Soviet aircraft ever flown. It should have been one of the nation's proudest moments, if not for the fact that just a year earlier, America had unveiled the F-100 Super Sabre, capable of flying at speeds that surpassed 920 miles per hour. Now, even supersonic flight wasn't enough. Somehow, the Soviet Union would have to create an aircraft that could not only break the barrier, but go twice as fast. The Korean War served as a testing ground for the Soviets. As herds of MiGs took to the skies, engineers filled notebooks with observations, marking the shortcomings of their creations while sketching the silhouettes of their Western rivals. Soon, prototypes for a new aircraft began to emerge on the drawing boards of Mikoyan-Gurevich. The early concepts, YE-1 and YE-2 carried swept wings and a prominent nose intake. But if the Soviets were to create a jet that could truly outrank the West, they would need something bolder. The gamble came in the form of the YE-4 prototype. Instead of traditional swept wings, it carried a clean triangular delta meant to give pilots greater stability and better fuel efficiency at supersonic speeds. It was a daring vision, but as the new generation of delta wing prototypes began to roar off the runway for their first flights during the summer of 1955, Soviet officials watching from below knew that McCoy and Grievich's idea had potential. However, there was no time for the company to rest. Rival firm Sukhoi was preparing to roll out a new interceptor of its own, the Su-9, threatening to claim the resources and contracts the MiG Design Bureau needed to survive. If the dynasty was to endure, the new MiG had to prove itself not just as a serviceable interceptor, but also as the Soviet Union's ultimate fighter. It had to be powerful, yet practical, simple enough to mass produce, light enough to maneuver, and easy to maintain, even for ground crews with little experience. Engineers found a way to answer all these requirements with the introduction of the Termansky R-25 afterburning turbojet. It wasn't the most powerful engine the USSR could build, but it was efficient, and most importantly, available. The final design was far from perfect. Poorly arranged fuel tanks made the aircraft unstable as they emptied, sometimes even starving the engine mid-flight and risking catastrophic failure during hard maneuvers. Its delta wings gave it blistering climb rates, but they came with a punishing trade-off. During battle, every sharp turn would bleed away precious speed. Yet for all its flaws, the fighter could still punch through the air at 1,351 miles per hour, more than twice the speed of sound. By 1956, the aircraft was already rolling off production lines. The era of the MiG-21 had begun. Measuring just under 45 feet in length and weighing a little less than 13,000 pounds, the Soviet Union's newest fighter was far lighter than its American rivals. Across the ocean, models like the Phantom F-4D tipped the scales at nearly twice the weight. On paper, the MiG-21's lean frame should have given it the edge in raw speed. In practice, however, even with its reduced weight, the aircraft often struggled to keep up. But for the Soviets, this was no longer a deal-breaker. With factories being able to churn them out by the hundreds, it would attack in packs, overwhelming its victims, even if they could fly faster. Yet there was still one critical weakness the Soviets needed to address before deploying their new jet. Even if squadrons of MiG-21s were able to swarm Western fighters, they lacked the firepower to guarantee victory. The early versions of the jet carried only twin 30mm cannons, hardly a match for US-made guided missiles. To make matters worse, the fighter's primitive radar was useless for hunting enemies at range, serving only as a rudimentary aiming aid that pilots could use only once the target was already in sight. But Soviet missile technology lagged far behind that of the West, and for a moment, it seemed the MiG-21's survival would depend solely on the skills of daring pilots and bold aerial maneuvers. However, just before the MiG-21 was formally deployed for combat, a gift quite literally fell from the sky, right into Soviet hands. By the late 1950s, Washington wasted no time in exporting some of its most advanced weapons to contain the communist tide, and when Chinese forces turned their guns on Taiwan, it didn't take long before American-built missiles were streaking across the battlefield. Chinese MiG-17s began taking off runways toward enemy positions, only to be met mid-air by American-made F-86 Sabres. These were slightly faster, but more importantly, they carried a devastating new weapon, the AIM-9 Sidewinder, the world's first infrared-guided missile. At the time, the Sidewinder was so exclusive that even the U.S. Air Force had limited access to it, being restricted solely for the U.S. Navy's use. The moment the Sidewinder entered combat, the rules of air warfare changed forever. No longer did a pilot need to close in and line up a perfect cannon shot. With the press of a button, a missile could be fired at range, locking onto the heat signature of an enemy jet and correcting its own course as the target tried to evade. More often than not, it ended with a loud explosion and a spiraling wreck plummeting down. Over the Taiwan Strait, the Sidewinder proved its might. Wave after wave of Chinese attacks were beaten back, their formation shattered by a weapon the communists couldn't yet match. However, victory came with a heavy cost. In one engagement, a Taiwanese pilot fired a Sidewinder at a Chinese MiG-17. The missile found its mark, but instead of detonating, it became stuck in the fuselage, still intact and refusing to explode. Fighting to keep control, the MiG pilot broke off and limped back to base, bringing with him what would become one of the greatest prizes Soviet engineers had ever received. The missile was carefully removed and examined. It was a technological treasure, far beyond anything the Soviets had yet achieved. And just as they had once reverse-engineered German weapons during the Second World War, Soviet scientists would now do the same with this American creation. By 1961, the Soviets had their new weapons ready to go. The K-13, a near-perfect clone of the Sidewinder, and once it was strapped beneath the wings of the MiG-21, the aircraft finally had the bite to match its bark. The first encounters between U.S. pilots and the MiG-21 took place above Vietnam in the mid-1960s. After years of involvement in the struggle between North and South, America was finally ready to send combat troops. Neither military strategists nor politicians wanted a drawn-out conflict, so in order to secure a rapid victory, hundreds of American aircraft joined Operation Rolling Thunder. They unleashed thousands of bombs on strategic targets in the north, determined to crush any resistance U.S. troops may encounter before it had a chance to spread. It was meant to be a swift and decisive operation, but the Americans had underestimated the enemy. On July 7, 1966, U.S. Air Force Captain Thomas, flying his Republic F-105 Thunderchief near Hanoi, suddenly found himself flanked by two MiG-21s, piloted by Win Not Chu and his wingman Tran Ngoc Su of the Vietnamese People's Air Force. Win was already a proven menace, credited with downing an American F-4 Phantom II in a MiG-17. Now, at the controls of the MiG-21, he was unstoppable. That day, his wingman proved it. Taking advantage of their speed, the pilots closed the distance with Captain Thomas before he could evade. One missile, fired by Tran, found its mark, sending the Thunderchief and its pilot crashing down. In the years that followed, this became a standard scene. Chu himself would go on to claim 4 more victories in his MiG-21, securing ace status alongside 13 other North Vietnamese MiG-21 pilots across the region. The jet, though heavily reliant on ground controllers to vector them toward targets and lacking the range of America's more advanced jets, was a vicious predator and soon turned into one of the most feared aircraft by U.S. pilots in Vietnam. However, their attacks did not rely solely on brute force. North Vietnamese pilots had traveled down to the Soviet Union to receive both practical and strategic training on aerial warfare, becoming masters of deception and guerrilla tactics. In some encounters, MiG squadrons would bait U.S. fighters into pursuit, only for another hidden flight of MiG-21s to close from behind and fire before the Americans even realized they were under attack. Time and again, Phantoms fell in ambushes, cut down by an enemy that fought by its own rules. America needed a shift in strategy, and fast. There was no time to design new aircraft or weapons. Striking MiGs on the ground was out of the question as well, as any direct attack on North Vietnamese airfields risked hitting Soviet or Chinese advisors and escalating the war. The only real option left was to beat the MiG-21 at its own game: deception, ambush, and ruthless close-range combat. Colonel Robin Olds was chosen to lead the mission that would turn the tables on the North Vietnamese. Flying in formation with a group of F-4 Phantoms, Olds mimicked the routes, speeds, and radio call signs of the slower, more vulnerable F-105 bombers. Hidden nearby, C-130 spy planes tracked enemy chatter and movements, feeding updates to Olds so he could strike at the perfect moment. The MiG-21 swooped in, expecting bombers, and all hell broke loose. And within minutes, 7 MiG-21s were destroyed. It was one of the most successful American missions against a pack of MiGs so far. Yet even this victory couldn't shift the aerial campaign. By 1968, nearly 1,000 American aircraft had been lost, many to MiG fire. Washington had little choice but to end Operation Rolling Thunder. It was the U.S. Navy that first decided its pilots needed specific training to survive Vietnam. The result was a new elite weapons school, better known today as the legendary Top Gun. A small group of hand-picked instructors was assembled, each a specialist in areas like weapons, tactics, and threat analysis. Together, they built a curriculum tailored to the brutal realities of Vietnam and began forging some of the finest pilots the Navy had ever seen. Their first challenge, teaching students how to defeat the fearsome MiG-21. To recreate the threat, Top Gun instructors used the supersonic F-106 Delta Dart to mimic the MiG, while students flew the Douglas A-4 Skyhawk or nimble F-5 Tiger II to practice countering it. In these mock battles, survival demanded more than flying skill. Pilots had to learn when and how to break contact, the best methods to strike back, and most critically, how to fire with precision. In real combat, they might only get one chance to pull the trigger. Whether or not their strike landed could be the difference between making it back home and not. It was a grueling program, and a long time passed before the Navy felt confident enough to send its newly sharpened pilots back into heavy combat over North Vietnam. But by the early 1970s, when they finally returned, they did so with a vengeance. Before Top Gun, Navy pilots could barely shoot down 2 MiGs for every jet lost. Afterward, the victory ratio skyrocketed, going as high as nearly 13 MiGs destroyed for every American aircraft downed. The U.S. eventually resumed aerial campaigns under Operations Linebacker 1 and 2, but Vietnam was nothing like Germany or Japan. This was not a nation that could be bombed into submission. No matter how many factories, roads, or bridges collapsed under American firepower, the enemy always found a way to keep the war machine running through hidden jungle supply routes and a constant flow of reinforcements coming in the form of MiG fighters, Soviet-supplied SAM missiles, and radar-guided artillery, building one of the most heavily defended skies on Earth. Even as Top Gun trained pilots fought tooth and nail to shield bombers and cut down enemy jets, there always seemed to be another MiG waiting to join the fight. By the early 1970s, there was no denying it. The American war effort was crumbling. Worse still, the U.S. had lost the support of its own people. Across the United States, protests demanded an end to the relentless bombing and the return of troops before more lives were claimed by the North Vietnamese. By 1973, Washington made the decision to withdraw. Just 2 years later, North Vietnam swept south, crushing its enemies and ending the war in absolute victory for the Communists, and by extension, the Soviet Union. A triumph owed in no small part to the formidable MiG-21. Despite its role as one of the most successful fighters of the Vietnam War, the years that followed would not be kind to the MiG-21's legacy. Across the Middle East, the Soviet jet had already begun to reveal its limitations. Egyptian and Syrian MiG-21s fell in droves, first to Israel's Dassault Mirage 3CJ, and later to even more capable opponents, the McDonnell Douglas F-15 Eagle and General Dynamics F-16 Fighting Falcon. During the Six-Day War, Israeli fighters were reported to have downed 6 Egyptian MiG-21s and 25 Syrian MiG-21s, forcing further Soviet assistance and equipment to be deployed into the region. Years later, during the Lebanon War of the 1980s, Israeli pilots claimed as many as 45 MiG-21 downings, seemingly ending the aircraft's dominance once and for all. The collapse of the Soviet Union only worsened matters. With production lines slowing and exports dwindling, the once mighty MiG-21 faced the threat of extinction. Yet the MiG-21 managed to maintain a respectable victory ratio until its successor, the MiG-29, was introduced in 1983. Even then, the MiG-21 did not fade away, and although its production officially ended in 1986, the aircraft and its Chinese-built twin, the Chengdu J-7, continue to serve in active squadrons across the world to this very day. With 10,645 units built in the Soviet Union and more than 1,000 additional aircraft produced in India and Czechoslovakia, the MiG-21 stands as one of the most heavily produced jet fighters in history. From the moment it first rolled off the production line, the MiG-21 has never stopped undergoing constant evolution. New variants have been introduced, weapon systems upgraded, and advanced electronics added, enhancing its radar, communications, and combat effectiveness to keep it relevant to the modern battlefield. Up until recently, some NATO nations still fielded the aircraft, while India and Syria remained some of its most dedicated operators, with around 36 and 50 MiG-21s respectively still active. Still, how much longer the MiG-21 will continue flying remains uncertain. Many of the nations that still keep the jet in service have already begun formal decommissioning programs, paving the way for new aircraft to finally succeed the Soviet icon.